part of this, I think, is also to do with the changing profession of journalism. Journalism used to be considered more of a tradesman skill, it's kind of a trade skill, a more blue-collar job, whereas nowadays most journalism, I think, is viewed both internally by journalists and externally by people that are not in the media as a kind of white-collar, professional job. Let's talk about like what newsrooms do well and what they do not so well in terms of diversity. So I think most modern newsrooms, from my observation, do make really conscientious and good efforts about diversifying their workforce in terms of like ethnic background, gender background. Journalists in any newsroom you see today, there's black people, there's Asians, there's women, there's men, there's gay people, there's straight people, there's transgender people. And I think that helps in some ways tell different stories about marginalized people. Otherwise, normally wouldn't get covered and haven't been covered in the same way historically in the past. When it was just a bunch of 1950, a bunch of white guys smoking around in pipes, their story selection was just different than the story selections you see in most modern newsrooms. That being said, that's not the only type of diversity. And here's where I think it gets a little more nuanced and tricky, and something diversity in newsrooms have a long way to go in, and that is diversity in class and diversity in thought. Now, a couple interesting things to think about is just like, where is most of the press and journalists coming from? Like, where is the press radiated out from? Where are their, Mount Mordors? Well, they're in New York City, they're in Washington, D.C., and they're in L.A. And those are the big press epicenters, and that's where most journalists live. Now, where are most journalists from? Where did they grow up? Well, they mainly grew up in the D.C. area, the kind of mid-Atlantic northeast coast, and Southern California. So not only do most journalists live in these three large metropolitan areas that are largely coastal cities, most journalists grew up there in those areas, and most journalists attended schools in that vicinity, whether it be a small kind of private liberal arts school in New England, or a school in Georgetown or USC in California, or Yale, or any of those classic schools you think of. That's a very common background for the average journalist to have, regardless of them being white or male or female or black or Asian or transgender or gay or straight or lesbian. Those elements may be diverse, but the class background that they grew up in and the geographical background they grew up in is very similar. And those are only small sections of the country of the United States. There are large swaths of people living not in LA, Washington, D.C., and New York that think and feel differently about the world and about politics and about culture than the people do that are living in those cities and have entirely different backgrounds. But so with those similar backgrounds, regardless of their sexual orientation or their skin color, those similar class backgrounds have a tendency to lead to a less diverse thought within a newsroom. Most people think and feel the same way, in each newsroom. For instance, most of them are liberal or at least independent. Like, I believe Politico did a survey where, 0% of the press pool in the White House was a registered Republican. No, I'm not saying that it's good or bad necessarily. I think a large part of them are actually registered as independents, and most of them voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election. My point simply being is that they're not actually very diverse. Now, there may be, a Muslim woman and a black guy and a lesbian white woman. Regardless of those diversity factors, there are some non-diverse factors that, create a hive mind mentality within any newsroom. And I think that's only been exacerbated by the way you've seen the kind of collapse of big regional papers, whether that be in Chicago or Cleveland or Kansas City or St. Louis or Omaha or Houston. And as those kind of regional centers in the Midwest and in Texas and the South collapse, you further, strengthen the coasts like California and DC and New York, further their strengthen and their vice grip on media and the press. And this ultimately has the same effect in some ways that people complained about before there was a, quote, diverse newsroom or diverse set of journalists, which was that, in the 1950s, the common, I think, complaint leveled is like, well, there's a bunch of white men, sitting around with the pipes, and they were controlling the stories and the story selections, and that's true. But you also saw interesting things. Like, for instance, journalists used to cover, like, trade organizations and unions much more heavily, and the kind of battles between companies and union organizers and labor, like, that used to be a much bigger part of most press coverage in the 40s, 50s, and 60s than it is today. I think most journalists today are very pro-WTO, pro-free trade, kind of the ultimate capitalist ideology, whereas I don't think actually the majority of Americans are. I think most Americans are somewhat protectionist, and their market economics. And you see this reflected on how Trump is able to tap into that in his rallies and his presidency. I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just making an observation. But so the same thing happens. Just as the certain demographic of journalists that made up newsrooms in the 1950s had a certain story selection and inherent bias about what they choose to cover, so do the journalists that make up modern newsrooms. And that's not because of their skin color or sexual orientation, but because of their class background. It's mainly a white-collar profession. They mainly come from doing middle to upper middle class parents. They went to, relatively, good, high-quality educated colleges. They lived in big, urban, liberal cities. And therefore, it shapes most of the story selection and reporting they do. And a lot of journalism isn't just pure reporting, but collating and contextualizing stories. And so that's why a lot of stories in modern journalism revolve around, like climate change or, technology and like Apple and Samsung and all the stuff that's, interests a specific demographic of people that necessarily doesn't represent somebody living in Omaha. So what's my prescription for all this? Yes, newsrooms do a very good job of making the newsrooms ethnically and, sexually diverse, but they do a very poor job of making newsrooms have a diversity of thought. The spectrum of people that are super evangelical, super liberal, super libertarian, not so much. They're mainly kind of just relatively liberal. That's the bulk of it. So not so good on that, and not so good on the kind of class background and understanding, people who had fathers that worked at payday loan companies or worked at the local auto dealership. Just not too much of that. And that in turn is ultimately, I think, a negative effect and lowers the quality of American journalism. Anyway, that's just my thoughts for today. If you guys want to watch another video, click around. See you guys tomorrow. Bye.